Well, welcome to Connecting the Beast in Daniel and Revelation and a proposed solution to some of these time prophecies: 1260, 1290, 1335, 2300, and 7 times. We're going to go through this at a pretty high level, and then in subsequent sessions we'll drill down and expand on some of these things. Let me just get my presentation here. Okay. Okay, so here's some of the assumptions we have. We assume that historicism is the correct paradigm, so not preterism or futurism, idealism. Historicism is the idea that these things roll out in history. One power supersedes another one, and we go forward in time. Preterism assumes that most of these prophecies were all completed in 70 AD. Futurism is waiting for much of them to be completed in the future, like with the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem and things like this. And idealism just means that we look at the powers for good in Revelation, and that God is going to deal with these evil powers, and that it all works out in the end. So idealism is always a an important part of this, but preterism and futurism is not convincing. So the angel in Daniel tells us that these powers roll out one after the other. So historicism is the correct paradigm for viewing this. Day for a year principle is correct. So we're assuming that. I'm not going to argue it here. If you want to see the argument, look at William Shea's discussion in Selected Studies on Prophetic Interpretation. If you Google William Shea and Selected Studies on Prophetic Interpretation, you'll find the document there. The Seventh-day Adventists allow you to download that. Another assumption is that all countries are beasts. There are no godly or special case countries today. Okay. I know that some people think that, well, for example, Israel is a special case, God's people, or the United States is a special case. You hear Bible commentators say the United States is not found in prophecy. I beg to differ. All countries are beasts. There's no godly or special case countries. So we're going to assume that. And we will not calculate when Jesus will return. That's been done enough, and enough people have made fools of themselves, and we're not going to try to do that here. All countries are beasts. Well, these are take one example, America here. So these are the military bases America has worldwide. So almost nearly 800 in more than 70 countries, right? So you'll hear people say, well, the United States is really only interested in sort of peace and spreading goodness and democracy and so forth. Well, it's got 800 military bases, more than any other country. What is it doing with these military bases? Well, here's the foreign policy record of the United States. So these are all the countries that the United States has either attempted or successfully overthrown. So starting with China back in the early, 1949 to the early 60s, it tried to overthrow China, Albania, East Germany, Iran, Guatemala, on and on and on. And everywhere it's gone, it's created misery. Now, why don't most Americans know this? Because most of these dirty deeds are done in the dark, and the American people really are not aware of what their own country is doing. So if you're looking for a country that would represent Rome in our time, because Rome is the enemy of God's people. Rome is the big bad guy. That's Imperial Rome. Persecuted Christians, executed Jesus, and so forth. If you're looking for a country that represents Rome today, this is definitely a strong candidate. It is the lone superpower in the world today, although it's getting challenged by China and Russia lately. But its defense budget is it's not really defense, but their military budget is 10 times is greater than the next 10 countries combined. It's just a massive military expenditures. So if it walks, talks, and thinks like an empire, it is an empire. Now, let's start at the end. We have on the left here, on my left, the famous statue in Daniel chapter 2. And it has a gold head, silver arms, bronze belly, and then legs of iron, and then feet of iron and clay. Now we know these powers, what these powers are. The angel tells us is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And then the end here is this little puzzle where you have iron and clay mixed together. And it's going to be a big rock that's going to be cut out of here and thrown at the feet of the statue, and it's going to be destroyed, and it's going to fill up the whole earth. That's God's kingdom. Now we also have another picture here near the end in Revelation 17, and this is this harlot that sits atop a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And we know that the 7-headed, 10-horn beast is Rome in some form. It's political power, and the harlot is God's people gone bad. A harlot in the Bible can be God's people who have gone bad. They become a harlot. How? Well, they go after other gods besides Yahweh, and they become a harlot, right? And they mingle with the kings of the earth, right? So there's 2 things that are going to happen here. A rock is going to be thrown at the foot of the statue, and it's going to be pulverized, and the kingdoms of this world will no longer exist. Only God's kingdom will. And here, this beast is going to turn on this harlot and destroy her, completely burn her with fire, which has not happened yet, but I believe is coming soon. So as we mentioned in Daniel 2, we have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and this feet of iron and clay, and we have this harlot, this mother of harlots. So it's not just a harlot, it's a mother of harlots, because she produces all these other churches. The beast with 7 heads and 10 horns is Rome in some form. It's political power. The clay is people, especially God's people. Okay, so we look at these, Isaiah, Jeremiah, 2 Corinthians, we see that God uses this metaphor of clay to represent his people. The harlot is God's people corrupted in apostasy, and the iron symbolizes Rome. So the clay is in an unclean relationship with iron. Okay, so at the end time, we expect false churches corruptly partnering with Roman-like governments, i.e. republics. And we see this today. We see in Russia, we have the Russian Orthodox Church in bed, as it were, with the Putin government. We have the evangelicals in Brazil in bed with a neo-fascist leader, Bolsonaro. We have the white evangelical church in the United States in bed with the Republican Party, and especially with its leader. Whenever we see clay in an unclean relationship with iron, we know that there's major corruption there. There's an abomination. And understanding what the abomination is really, really important. An abomination refers to objects and practices which are an affront to God, such as idolatry, sexual misconduct, magic and divination, injustice and lying, hypocritical worship. So these are all abominations to God. And in Matthew 24, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So this abomination of desolation, it's something tricky, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, or as Mark, I think, says, standing where it ought not. And then he says, let the reader understand. It's not going to be easy to understand. And then Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, recognize that her desolation is near. Okay? Now, most commentators, they say that the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem and in the temple area was the abomination. I don't think so. I mean, if we think about this, the Jewish religious leadership was in an unclean relationship with Rome. And so it was an abomination. Whenever you have God's people mixed with, Roman power, political power, it's an abomination. So you have the Sanhedrin, plotting to kill Jesus and working with Rome to subdue the people. So there's sort of two parts to it. There's the abomination, and then there's a desolation that comes, the desolators. As Daniel 9:27 puts it, on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. So it comes as a consequence of the abomination. And so we have Daniel's 70-week prophecy here, which we went through in our Bible study group, West Coast Bible Study. But we're going to go through it fairly quickly here. But this is 70 weeks, and as William Shea argues that the correct date to begin should be the first decree of Artaxerxes, 457 BCE, using the fall new year that the Hebrews used, which is going to be different than Babylonian or other Egyptian system. So William Shea has 457 as the start date for that. There's 7 weeks to rebuild the temple, and then 62 weeks, and the Messiah is going to come here. 27C, he gets baptized. Halfway through the week, he gets crucified, which ends the sacrifice. He will put a stop to the sacrifices, right? He will put a stop to the sacrifices because he's executed. But he keeps the covenant in effect. He confirms the covenant for that whole week. So for 3.5 years after Jesus' death, the gospel is still going primarily to the Jews first. But in 34 CE, and we can get this date, Stephen does what's called a prophetic lawsuit, a covenant lawsuit. So he basically prosecutes the Jewish religious leadership there. Yahweh, God the Father, and his son Jesus are up in heaven. Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father, looking down on this, and they stone Stephen. The Christians are scattered. The gospel goes to the Gentiles, and there's a conversion of Paul. So that was the 70-week prophecy, which ends in 34 CE. That prophecy is fulfilled. The abomination of desolation. Let me just see if there's anybody that's come in. No, just me so far. Okay. So the abomination of desolation. Okay, this comes later, 66 to 70, right? So the temple was destroyed. The city and the temple was destroyed in the year 70. But prior to that, there was an uprising. So, trying to understand the abomination of desolation. So the Jewish religious leadership was in an unclean relationship with the Roman government, using religion to suppress and control the people. Okay, so sentences passed on them, and the gospel goes out to the Gentiles. In the Jewish revolt, violent Jewish revolutionaries attacked Roman soldiers, killed fellow Jews. They were barricaded in the temple itself. So this was the abomination standing where it ought not. You had these terrorists basically held up in the temple that were, the de facto Jewish leadership as it was all falling apart, and they were killing their fellow Jews, and in the temple. It was quite disgusting. But they were standing where they ought not. So the Roman soldiers with the pagan symbols were not the abomination Daniel spoke of. They were the desolation that comes on the wing of abominations. In other words, the desolation comes as a consequence of the abominations. So, in Bible prophecy, abomination of desolation means God's people partnering corruptly with Caesar, which brings on God's judgment in the form of desolations. What else happens near the end? We're trying to figure out what happens near the end. Well, in Daniel 7, we have these 4 beasts. Incidentally, if you add up the number of heads on these beasts, it's 7, which is the same number of heads the beasts in Revelation have. So there's a connection there. The last beast of these 4 beasts has 10 horns and sprouts a little horn that wears down the saints for times and half a time, but is judged and destroyed. The kingdom is given to the Son of Man and the saints. So this is initially Imperial Rome and then the papacy. When Imperial Rome was destroyed, the papacy arose to fill the vacuum of power that was left. and the papacy becomes the new Rome. Papacy would oppress for 1260 years, but is neutered at the French Revolution. At the French Revolution, the framers of the French Constitution made sure that the church had no role in the running of the country. Completely cut out, lost its power. The 10 horns refer to northern tribes that conquered Rome. Later, they'll become the beast from the abyss, first France, then the EU. So what happens here is imperial Rome is destroyed by northern tribes in the 5th century. The papacy arises like in the 6th century, and it becomes the sort of Rome of its time. But then these northern tribes, Gothic tribes, and there's about 10 of them or so, they attack Rome and they conquer it, and later they would become the Europe and the countries of Europe. In Daniel 8, there's a ram with 2 horns, Media and Persia. Incidentally, the lamb with 2 horns means there's 2 powers, Media and Persia. The lamb of Revelation 13, 11 to 18, also has 2 horns. So there must be 2 powers that are in a partnership. Media and Persia lose the battle to the male goat, which is Alexander the Great. His horn is broken, and 4 generals arise. Out of one of them refers to one of the 4 winds. That's Shia's discussion. You can see in the Journal of Prophetic Prophecy that I mentioned earlier. This is a huge mistake, because this little power comes out of one of the 4 winds, not out of one of the 4 horns. Most commentators, almost all of them, think that this power comes out of one of the 4 horns, and thinks that therefore it must be one of the Syrian kings. And then they say, well, it must be Antiochus Epiphanes, because he's a Syrian king, and he came into Israel and he sacrificed pigs in the temple and did all kinds of horrible things to the Jews. But he doesn't fulfill the prophecy. There's no way. First of all, the power comes out of one of the 4 winds, not out of one of the 4 horns. And this is Rome. Rome arises from the west, conquers to the south and the east in the beautiful land. Israel conquers Israel, and out of Rome comes the papacy. So this prophecy in Daniel 8 is really talking about the rise of Rome, and that it would be for 2,300 day years, 2,300 evenings and mornings, as is put in the prophecy, spans from the creation of the Republic of Rome in 509 BCE to the Republic of France in 1792, exactly 2,300 years. So Rome arises in 509. It really comes to its own in 509 when it becomes a republic. A republic is, a country that is ruled by laws and representative government. And once Rome did that, it was able to expand very quickly, because other powers wanted to be part of Rome. And Rome expanded very quickly to become the leading superpower. And then the papacy arose, and it became a religious political power for right up until the French Revolution. But in 1792, it was all over for the religious powers. The kings and the queens of Europe had enough of being pushed around by religious people and all the wasteful wars, and they didn't want it anymore. In Daniel 11:40, it says, at the end time, right? So this is right near the end here. The king of the north, which I believe is Western Roman power, will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, no one will help him. So this is like the end of the king of the north. I believe these are Western powers. Just about every commentator wants to say, well, no, it can't be the United States or Europe, because they're nice, Christian people who believe in democracy and so forth. But as I showed you, this is really a lie. This is really not what these powers are about at all. So at the very end here, the king of the north will collide with the king of the south, but the north will win decisively, enter the beautiful land, and conquer and control other countries in the Middle East, and gain control of the valuable things of Egypt. So I believe this is describing Western powers, led first by Britain, then America, in subjugating the Middle East in order to control its oil resources. And if you look at the history of the Middle East from the from the 1900s forward. First it was Britain, and they went up and they divided up the Middle East into oil patches, gave them to some to one friend, some to another friend. And then as America eclipsed Britain after the Second World War, it said, well, we want to have lion's share. So they went into the Middle East, and then you had all these wars in the Middle East. And you know, despite what the politicians told us, it was all about oil control. That was the main reason. Now, very interesting. This king of the north will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful mountain. Let's have a look and see where that is on Google Maps. I'm hoping you can see this. Between the seas is between the Dead Sea over here, and this is the Mediterranean on the left. It's between the seas and the holy mountain. That's Mount Zion. Where is that? It's Jerusalem. It's the modern day city of Jerusalem. So the prophecy again says, he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and there'll be no helper for him. The United States moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in the year 2018. Against all the advice from all the surrounding countries, they did it anyways. Well, is not the embassy the modern equivalent of a military camp? They have all their, secret agents and everything, and spying devices and all kinds of things there, and military people. So that's very interesting that it was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in 2018. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. So I believe this is describing Western powers led by first Britain, then the United States, and subjugating the Middle East in order to control its oil resources. Okay. This is a high-level view of my work we're looking at the working out of religious freedom in prophecy. Okay. Now, if you look here, this is year 313. This one is the Roman. This is the 2300 years. So that goes from 509 up to 1792. Okay. So, but if we're looking at this date, 313 CE, Constantine Edict of Milan. A lot of these people that are doing prophecy based on these, 3.5 times and the 1260 years and so on, they're looking for a start date. Like, when did things go bad? Because that is that's going to be key. That's going to be key. And I think things go bad at the year 313 CE when Constantine he had united the Roman Empire. He conquered all his competitors. He was now sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and he in 313 he issues the Edict of Milan. What that did is stop the persecution, and it returned the lands and gave them funding and supported the Christian church, right? But they had to report to Constantine. Constantine considered himself the head of the church. So I think things went sour in the year 313. The church got sucked into Constantine's offer, and they climbed into bed, as it were, with Constantine and became a harlot at that point. And I think this 1260-year period. There's one period for the suppression of true worship, and there's another period for the papacy and its reign. So I think there's two periods, because if you look at these prophecies, some are just talking about how religion would be suppressed, how God's people would have to go out into the wilderness, and another period speaks very specifically of an individual with a loud mouth that is blasphemous and so on. That's the papacy saying they're the vicar of Christ, they're only the unique representation of Christ on earth. Okay, this is blasphemous, right? You should never say something like that. That's just blasphemous. No man has that position. No one. So if we say 313, assume 313 is where things went bad. 1260 years later, we get the Warsaw Confederation. What's that? Well, That was the Polish Brethren, and they actually were able to create a state along with the political leadership that allowed freedom of conscience. So people could move to Poland. So after this, there was so much persecution. Once Constantine set himself up as head of the church, they would have these church councils, and they would declare people heretics and persecute them and so on. So the very next year, for example, in 314, there was a Donatist controversy. So Constantine sat himself down, called a conference, had all these bishops around him, and the Donatists said, well, we don't think that people who caved in under pressure should be, during the persecution, should be in leadership in the church. They had a meeting, and Constantine said, they're fine. They're fine. Yeah, let them be the leaders. And so these people who had caved in under the persecution then became church leaders, right? So, what does that tell you? It's going downhill quickly. In 1573, though, the Polish Brethren, exactly 1,260 years later, create this state, and you could move to Poland. If you're being persecuted, you could move to Poland. And I should tell you here at this point that the persecution was not just the Roman Catholic Church. Protestant state churches did exactly the same thing. Remember the mother of harlots, the harlot that sits atop the beast in Revelation 17. She's the mother of harlots. The Protestant churches came out of here, and the Protestant state churches did the same thing. Calvin, tortured and killed people. He had Michael Servetus murdered, and I could go on and on. I mean, the Church of England, had people, persecuted people and had them burned at the stake and that. And so it was really terrible. You will know them by their fruits, right? And these ideas from the Polish Brethren, it's not very well known, but they influenced John Locke, Jefferson in the United States. They had copies of these guys' books, and the printing presses were going. And these ideas that religion should not be attached to political power. It's a separate thing. We report to Jesus. We don't report to Caesar, right? This was really, ever since Constantine, it was just assumed that religion always reports to the leader of your state, right? Now, there's this very interesting prophecy here where in Daniel 11, where he's talking about, the 1,290 years. And then 1,335 years. How happy are those who make it to the 1,335 years? What's that all about? Well, if we again start at 313 when Constantine, declares himself head of the church, and he was, by the way, a sun god worshiper and a murderer. So it's not like people argue about whether he was a Christian or not. You can't be a Christian and murder your own family. Sorry, can't be a Christian and be a sun god worshiper either. So now, this 1,290 years, this is in Daniel 12:11. There'll be 1,290 years, and then they will set up the abomination of desolation, right? Well, what happened if we go from here, 1330, we get 1603? What happened? We have something called, historians called Stuart absolutism. This is in England. So this was the Stuarts, right? So there was King James, and then his son, King Charles. And James declared that the divine right of kings. He called a conference. He declared himself answerable only to God, and he says the church answers to me, and the political system and the people answer to me. I only answer to God. So it was just totally blasphemous. And on top of that, he was really quite a disgusting person. He had a queen, but he was also liked homosexual lovers. So he would parade around the palace with his young homosexual lovers. And so, the guy was a real disgusting guy, and declaring himself to be, the head of the church was an abomination. Now, in 1648, the Parliament had enough of the Stuarts, and they arrested Charles. Put him in jail for treason, and he was executed in the early New Year. And that was the end of the Stuart abomination. But why does God have this here, this peace here? We'll get back to that. But there was other things going on in 1648. We ended the Stuart abomination here in 1648. But also in 1648 was the Treaty of Westphalia. So that's why the prophecy says, happy is he who who lives to the 1335 days, survives to the 1335 days. Why? Well, in England, you had the end of the Stuart abomination, and then England would be on track to religious freedom. Not quite yet, but it was moving in the right direction. You also had the end of the 30-year war in Northern Europe. This war was one of the most bloodiest wars that Europe has ever fought. It was 30 years of slaughter. It was Protestants against Catholics. And in 1648, they had the Treaty of Westphalia. And at this point, the kings and queens of Europe had said, you know what, we've had enough of these religious people. They're making it impossible to manage this country. They're causing wars over, what version of the Trinity you believe or something, right? And they said, that's enough. So they had this Treaty of Westphalia, and they said that any king or queen can declare what their state church is, which denomination it is, right? And so you had some, elements of freedom. You could at least move to a country that, had the same beliefs as you did. So 1648 was freedom for, to a large extent for God's people. Okay? And then we have the Act of Toleration in 1688, and then finally the Unitarian Relief Act in 1813. Okay? So why this, though? Why is God showing us this thing with the Stuarts here? James Stewart and his son Charles Stewart. What's God trying to tell us? Well, he's trying to tell us that Rome is now in the Lamb Beast with two horns, okay? The power of Rome has shifted to the Lamb Beast. That's what God is telling us here. And to look out for an abomination. An abomination and a 666 man. If you look at Revelation 13, there's a 666 man. The 666 man just means look for someone that's extremely sinful and someone that wants to rule as a dictator. Has no interest in in democracy, and that's the Stuarts. And they kept shutting down Parliament. They wouldn't let Parliament operate, and then finally Parliament got rid of them. So what God is telling us is, in the Lamb Beast with the two horns that speaks as the dragon, it now has the power of Rome, and we've seen that the United States is the most powerful country in the world by a long, long shot. Its army, the cost for its army is is greater than the next 10 countries combined. Okay, and then down. So we got to focus on this Lamb Beast. What's going on with that? Because it's important. And watch out for somebody, the 666 man. That's somebody that's exceedingly sinful, and that wants to rule as a king. Doesn't like democracy. Doesn't like laws. So we have to watch out for that. And here's a sort of a predecessor of it, or a preview here in the Stuarts. And then meanwhile in America we have Roger Williams and we have Roger Williams and William Penn down here. And Roger Williams and William Penn are working hard in the States trying to promote freedom of conscience. And Roger Williams is getting persecuted by the Massachusetts colony. He had all kinds of grief from them. But eventually these ideas from the Polish Brethren through Jefferson, through Locke, we end up with the 1791, the U.S. Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And that kept religion outside of politics. And that's almost the same year as we have the French Revolution here, where in 1792 the French Republic is formed, and that basically says bye-bye religion. You're not going to be sharing in power anymore. Okay, so 1792, 1791, we have freedom from oppressive religion, legally. Now the papacy here, the 1260 years of papacy, as I mentioned, these 1260 years, some seem to describe suppression of religion. So you would find it very, very difficult to worship God. Others talk about the career of the Pope, the papacy rather, and that institution. So that's this 1260 years is the career of the papacy, right? So I believe it starts in 555 because 555 was the final pronunciation or edict by Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, creating the office of the Bishop of Rome. There was, I think, 2 or 3 proclamations, and this was the last one. If we had 1,260 years, we get 1815, and Napoleon is deposed in 1815. And I think the reason I think these dates are more correct is because what happened was a lot of our Seventh-day Adventist brothers will say it's, well, from the rise of the papacy until 1798, where Napoleon deposes the Pope, but has him arrested. But in 1809, but then that was Pius VI, but Pius VII is reinstated, and then he's deposed in 1809, and then Napoleon puts the Catholic Church underneath him. And now remember, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe. We were right near a point where France would be ruling all of Europe, and Napoleon put the papacy under him and wanted to create a totalitarian system of government where he would be the absolute dictator, the emperor, and the church would be under him, and he would run Europe basically. But the French Parliament said, no way, Jose, and they deposed him. And so that was the end of Napoleon, and that was the end of the papacy's attempt to make a comeback. So the papacy is now awaiting judgment. I mean, it hasn't been completely destroyed, but it will be. Finally, down in the bottom here, there's this prophecy about Babylon. You may recall that there's a prophecy where this tree is chopped down, which represents Babylon, but it's bound with 2 metal rings, one made out of bronze and one made out of iron. And I'm just surprised that other commentators haven't noticed this, because as soon as you say bronze ring around the stump, so the tree was cut down and it had these 2 rings around it to prevent it from growing until 7 times passes. Now, in the original prophecy, the 7 times were 7 years, where King Nebuchadnezzar was restored to his kingship. But if you consider the bronze means Greece and iron means Rome, this, I think, has a much longer time frame. I think what this is saying is, Nebuchadnezzar was restored after 7 years, but there's a longer running prophecy at work here too. So if we multiply the 7 times to be 7 prophetic years of 360 each, we end up with 2,520 years. And let's see, Greece was defeated by Rome in 31 CE, and that means that the bronze ring was snapped off, cut off the tree, but the tree still can't grow because it's got this iron ring. Well, Rome was defeated by the 10 tribes in 476, but Rome arose in the papacy. But the papacy is defeated here, with Napoleon being deposed and the French Republic's, the Constitution of the French Republic. So papacy is defeated here, and that means that the iron ring is now cut off, and the tree can grow again, and that takes us to 1982. So in 1980, there was an abomination in America. After America had been formed with the distinct idea of separation of church and state, and not favoring one church over the other, in 1980 Reagan was elected with evangelicals supporting him. And I say this is an abomination because evangelicals prior to that had been mostly concerned about good works, and they were quite proud of themselves that they stayed out of politics, which they rightly saw as corrupting and dirty work. But they were pursued as a voting bloc by some very conniving people. You had the moral majority in the late 1970s and 80s. Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, and what they did is they convinced the evangelicals that they had to vote Republican because the Democrats were going to, bring in all these horrible laws and things and destroy the country. So 1980 is the point where evangelicals basically traded Jesus for the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan. I know some people find this hard to take, but that's the way I see it. And then in 1982, exactly 2,520 years after Babylon falls, the bronze ring, Greece, is cut. The iron ring, Rome, is then cut. And what grows out of it? Ronald Reagan goes to Britain in 1982, and for the first time in American and British history, gives a speech to the British Parliament. And he outlines, so-called freedom, so-called democracy, how it's, all going to be great in America and Britain together are going to lead the world into this, into this vision, right? So this is what the purpose of this here is. What Reagan has said is Babylon has arisen in the United States and Britain. And the lamb beast here with two horns is a partnership between two powers, and those two powers are Britain and the United States. And this is confirmed in 1982 when Babylon arises again in the British-American partnership. And I know some of this is going by pretty quickly, and in subsequent sessions we'll break it down. We'll break it down and get into more details. So what's left to be fulfilled then? Well, there's this 10 horns here. The 10 horns are going to destroy Greater Babylon. So there's these 10 horns, which are these European powers, or in a broader sense, could be all republics of the earth, because you have it's not just Europe. You have in Brazil, you have a harlot church in league with the government. In African countries, you have these prosperity gospel, con men preachers, and they're connected up with the political system too. So it's kind of worldwide. But these 10 horns are going to destroy the Greater Babylon. Now, the Babylon, in this sense, is the religious part of it. The harlot that sits atop the beast. There's going to be this proclamation of peace and security. The beast and the false prophet are destroyed. The beast is the political system. The false prophet is now the name of the lamb beast. And this is odd. This is odd because it's called a lamb beast here, but when it's destroyed, it's called a false prophet. So I don't know if that means that the religious aspect of the lamb beast is going to be destroyed, or it means something else. I'm not quite sure. But if you look at Revelation 19:20, you'll see that the false prophet does the same things that the lamb beast does. It's the same power. So it's going to become this. There's going to be some false prophet aspect of the lamb beast that's going to become much clearer as we go forward, and perhaps a religious. It's going to be maybe religious and political or something. Satan is imprisoned for 1,000 years, and then there's the 1,000-year kingdom of God, and that's the overview there. And like I said, in subsequent sessions, we'll go into more detail. So we're going to look at next time more details about America and Britain in prophecy. I will go into more details about this two-horned lamb beast, which I firmly believe is the British-American partnership, and we'll look at some of these other beasts and take some questions and get into more details of how those things work. And I'll post the Part 2 info on Faithline. So thanks very much for your attention. Appreciate you coming out today.